Welcome to English Stories Journey. Listen, relax, and grow your English with every story. When people think of coffee today, one name usually comes to mind: Starbucks. But long before it became a global giant with thousands of cafes around the world, Starbucks was simply a small store in Seattle. The year was 1971, and at that time, nobody could have imagined how this little shop would change the way people drink coffee across the globe. Seattle in the early 1970s was a city famous for rain, ships, and a growing music culture, but it was not yet famous for coffee. In fact, most Americans didn't drink very good coffee. People usually bought big tins of ground coffee from supermarkets. It was cheap, convenient, and often bitter. Few people paid attention to the quality of the beans or where they came from. Coffee was seen more as a routine drink to wake up in the morning, rather than an experience to be enjoyed. Against this background, three young men, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Boker, decided to do something different. They were passionate about good coffee and wanted to share that passion with others. Baldwin was an English teacher, Siegel was a history teacher, and Boker was a writer. None of them were businessmen at first, but they were curious, adventurous, and willing to take risks. The three friends were inspired by a man named Alfred Peet, the founder of Peet's Coffee in California. Peet had introduced Americans to the idea that coffee could be special, roasted with care, rich in flavor, and sourced from different regions of the world. Baldwin, Siegel, and Boker were fascinated by this idea. They wanted to open a store where people could buy the same kind of high-quality beans. With Peet as their mentor, they learned the art of roasting coffee and the importance of freshness.
So, in 1971, they opened their first shop in the historic Pike Place Market in Seattle. Pike Place was already a busy area where fishermen, farmers, and local vendors sold their goods. Tourists came there to see the lively atmosphere, street performers, and fresh seafood. For the founders, it was the perfect place to introduce something new. The shop was small and simple. It didn't have the comfortable chairs, Wi-Fi, or friendly baristas that Starbucks is known for today. Instead, it looked more like a specialty grocery store. On the shelves, you could see bags of coffee beans, shiny grinders, and brewing equipment. Customers came in, smelled the fresh aroma of roasted beans, and learned how to make better coffee at home. In fact, in those early years, Starbucks did not sell cups of coffee to drink. That may sound surprising today, but the original idea was not to create a cafe. The founders wanted people to buy beans, take them home, and brew the coffee themselves. They believed that if people learned about good coffee, they would never go back to the tasteless supermarket brands. The choice of the name was also unusual. The three founders wanted something that connected to adventure, the sea, and tradition. They considered many names, but finally decided on Starbucks, which came from a character in the famous novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Starbuck was the first mate of the ship Pequod, a serious, reliable sailor. The name also reminded them of the old tradition of coffee traders who crossed the oceans to bring beans from faraway lands. For Baldwin, Siegel, and Boker, the name symbolized strength, tradition, and exploration. To make the brand even stronger, they created a logo. The first Starbucks logo was very different from the green mermaid we know today. It showed a brown image of a twin-tailed siren, a figure from Greek mythology surrounded by the words Starbucks, coffee, tea, and spices. The siren was chosen to represent the sea and the idea of seduction, just as coffee could seduce or attract people with its rich aroma and flavor. Some customers thought the siren looked unusual, even strange, but it quickly became part of the store's identity. In the first year, Starbucks attracted a small but loyal group of customers. These were people who wanted something better than ordinary supermarket coffee. Many of them were young professionals, students, or travelers who were curious about new tastes. The founders spent time educating their customers, explaining where beans came from, what the difference between light and dark roasts was, and how to grind coffee properly. In a way, Starbucks was not just selling coffee beans, it was teaching people to appreciate coffee. The business was not always easy. Running a store, importing beans, and keeping them fresh required hard work. Baldwin, Siegel, and Boker often worked long hours roasting beans by hand, cleaning the shop, and talking to every customer. They were not making huge profits, but they believed in their mission. Slowly, the word spread. People in Seattle began to recognize that Starbucks was different. The beans were fresher, the flavor was stronger, and the knowledge behind the product made customers feel special. Soon, Starbucks became known as the place to go if you wanted real, quality coffee.
During the 1970s, Starbucks grew little by little. The founders opened a few more stores in Seattle, but they still stayed local. Unlike today, the brand had no ambitions to expand across the country, let alone the world. For Baldwin, Siegel, and Boker, it was enough to share their love of coffee with their city. By the early 1980s, Starbucks was still a small, local company in Seattle. It had a good reputation for selling high-quality coffee beans, and loyal customers came to buy their supplies. But outside Seattle, almost nobody had ever heard of Starbucks. At this stage, it was not yet a cultural symbol or a worldwide brand. It was simply a well-respected store for coffee lovers. Then came the man who would completely change the company's future, Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, to a working-class family. His father was a truck driver, and his mother worked at home. Life was not always easy. Schultz later said that growing up in a poor neighborhood gave him a strong desire to succeed. He was the first person in his family to attend college, studying communications at Northern Michigan University. After graduation, he worked in sales for different companies and slowly began to build a career. By 1981, Schultz was working for a Swedish company that sold kitchen equipment, including coffee makers. As part of his job, he often checked which businesses were buying their products. That was when he noticed something unusual. One small company in Seattle was ordering an impressive number of coffee makers. The company's name was Starbucks. Curious, Schultz decided to visit Seattle and see what kind of business it was. The moment he walked into a Starbucks store, he felt something powerful. He later described the smell of roasted beans, the dedication of the staff, and the sense of quality that filled the shop. It was completely different from the typical American supermarket coffee section. Schultz was fascinated. He believed Starbucks had something special, something that could grow far beyond Seattle. Schultz was so impressed that he asked to work for the company. At first, the founders were not interested. They were proud of what they had built, but they wanted Starbucks to remain small and focused. They didn't imagine expansion across the country. But Schultz was persistent. He believed he could bring new energy and new ideas to Starbucks. Finally, in 1982, the founders agreed to hire him as Director of Retail Operations and Marketing. It was not the top job, but it gave Schultz the chance to show what he could do. At this point, Starbucks still sold mostly beans, equipment, and a few accessories. Schultz's job was to find ways to attract more customers and make the brand stronger. But soon, something happened that changed everything. A business trip to Italy. In 1983, Schultz traveled to Milan, Italy. What he found there amazed him. In Italy, coffee was not just a drink. It was a daily ritual, a moment of pleasure, and a way of life. In almost every neighborhood, there were espresso bars, small cafes where people stood at the counter, drank a quick espresso, and exchanged a few words with the barista. These places were full of energy, conversation, and community. Schultz noticed something important. In Italy, coffee shops were not only about the product, they were about the experience. People came not just for caffeine, but for connection. The barista knew their names, their favorite drinks, and sometimes even their family stories. The cafe was like a social center. For Schultz, this was a revelation. He thought, why don't America have this? At that time, most Americans drank weak, cheap coffee at home or at the office. Cafes existed, of course, but they were nothing like the vibrant espresso bars of Milan. Schultz saw an opportunity. Starbucks could bring this Italian coffeehouse culture to the United States. Starbucks would need to sell drinks to make that happen, so he proposed to the founders that they start offering espresso drinks in their stores.
When Schultz returned to Seattle, he was full of excitement. He told the Starbucks founders about what he had seen in Italy and explained his vision. Starbucks should not only sell beans, but also prepare and serve drinks, espressos, cappuccinos, and lattes in a cafe-style environment. But the founders disagreed. They were traditionalists. For them, Starbucks was about selling high-quality beans and equipment, not about serving cups of coffee. They didn't want to turn the store into a cafe. In their minds, Schultz's idea was risky, even dangerous. Schultz, however, could not let go of the vision. He was convinced that the future of Starbucks depended on embracing this Italian-inspired model. Eventually, Schultz persuaded the company to let him test the idea. In 1984, Starbucks opened a small cafe in downtown Seattle where they served brewed coffee and espresso drinks. To Schultz's delight, customers loved it. They enjoyed trying cappuccinos and lattes, and many said it reminded them of the European cafes they had visited while traveling. The experiment proved that Schultz's vision could work, but still, the founders were not interested in changing the company's entire direction. They preferred to stay small and focus on beans. This disagreement eventually led Schultz to make a bold decision. He would leave Starbucks and start his own company to pursue his dream. In 1985, Schultz left Starbucks and created his own business called Il Giornale, Italian for The Daily. Inspired by the Italian bars he had seen, Il Giornale offered espresso, cappuccino, and other drinks in a friendly, cafe-like atmosphere. It was stylish, modern, and different from typical American coffee shops. At first, many people doubted that Americans would pay more money for coffee drinks. After all, they were used to cheap coffee at home or in diners. But Schultz proved them wrong. Il Giornale quickly became popular, and customers enjoyed the European-style experience. It wasn't just about drinking coffee, it was about feeling part of something special. Schultz now had proof his vision could succeed. But he still felt connected to Starbucks, the company that had first inspired him. In 1987, the original Starbucks founders decided to sell the company. They were ready to move on, and Starbucks was still relatively small, only 6 stores. For Schultz, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. With the help of investors, he bought Starbucks and merged it with Il Giornale. Now at last, Schultz was in control, and he had a clear mission to transform Starbucks from a small regional chain into a company that brought the Italian cafe culture to America and eventually the world.
Schultz's dream was clear. Starbucks should not simply sell beans or equipment. It should create a coffeehouse experience. Inspired by the espresso bars of Italy, he imagined stores where people could come not only to buy coffee, but also to spend time, talk, read, or even work. This was a new idea for the United States in the late 1980s. At that time, American cafes were not very popular, and coffee was mostly consumed at home or in diners. People saw coffee as fuel, something quick and practical, not something to be enjoyed slowly.
Schultz wanted to change the culture itself. He wanted Starbucks to introduce the concept of the third place. Not home, not work, but a welcoming space in between. Of course, having a vision is one thing, making it real is another. In the first years after Schultz took over, Starbucks faced many challenges. The company needed money to expand, but not everyone believed in his idea. Many investors were skeptical. They thought Americans would never pay more than $1 for a cup of coffee when they could easily brew it at home. But Schultz was determined. He worked tirelessly to raise funds, build relationships, and convince people that his vision was worth supporting. He told investors that Starbucks was not just selling coffee, it was selling an experience. It was about quality, atmosphere, and community. Slowly, he gained the support he needed. With the funding secured, Schultz began to open new stores. But he didn't want them to feel like typical shops. He paid attention to every detail. The aroma of freshly ground coffee had to greet customers as soon as they entered. The music in the background was carefully chosen to create a warm, relaxed mood. The design of the stores included wooden counters, comfortable chairs, and soft lighting. The baristas were trained not just to serve drinks, but also to connect with customers, learn their names, and make them feel welcome. Even the simple act of writing a customer's name on a cup became part of the experience. It made people feel recognized and special. Starbucks also introduced drinks that were new for many Americans. Words like latte, cappuccino, and espresso became part of everyday language. For some customers, these drinks felt exotic and sophisticated, as if they had suddenly stepped into a European cafe. By the early 1990s, Starbucks was expanding rapidly. New stores opened not just in Seattle, but also in other American cities. People were curious, and many were excited to try something different. For young professionals, Starbucks became a stylish place to meet friends or take a break from work. For students, it was a comfortable space to read or study. The company's growth was impressive. In 1992, Starbucks went public, selling shares on the stock market. This provided new capital for expansion and made Schultz's dream even more realistic. Soon, there were hundreds of Starbucks stores across the United States. Success did not come without problems. Rapid growth put pressure on the company. Some critics said Starbucks was moving too fast and losing its soul. Others complained that prices were too high. After all, paying $2 or $3 for a coffee seemed shocking to many Americans at the time. But Schultz defended his vision. He argued that Starbucks offered something more than coffee. It offered an atmosphere, a place to belong, and a sense of connection. For him, quality and experience justified the price, and many customers agreed.
By the mid-1990s, something remarkable had happened. Starbucks had not only grown as a company, it had changed the way Americans thought about coffee. What had once been just a cheap morning drink was now seen as a treat, a lifestyle choice, and even a personal identity. People didn't just say, "I want a coffee." They said, "I want a tall latte," or "I'll have a cappuccino." Starbucks introduced new vocabulary, new habits, and new expectations. The idea of the third place became a reality. Starbucks cafes were full of people working on laptops, meeting friends, or simply relaxing with a book. It was no longer strange to spend hours in a coffee shop. In fact, it became normal. As Starbucks grew in the United States, Schultz began to think globally. Why stop at America? If Italian coffee culture could inspire him, then perhaps Starbucks could inspire people in other countries. In 1996, Starbucks opened its first international store in Tokyo, Japan. It was a huge success.
Customers there embraced the brand, and soon more international locations followed. This move marked the start of Starbucks as a truly global brand. The company was no longer just an American success story, it was becoming a worldwide phenomenon. By the late 1990s, Starbucks had already conquered the United States. Its green mermaid logo was instantly recognizable in cities and suburbs from coast to coast. But Howard Schultz had always dreamed bigger. He didn't just want to sell coffee in America, he wanted to change the way the world experienced coffee. And after the successful launch of Starbucks in Japan in 1996, the company set its sights on the rest of the globe. Japan was only the first step. After that, Starbucks moved quickly into other parts of Asia, opening stores in Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and China. Each country brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. In China, for example, tea had been the traditional drink for centuries. Many experts thought Starbucks would fail. But Schultz believed that younger Chinese customers curious about Western culture would welcome the coffeehouse experience. He was right. Over time, China became one of Starbucks' most important markets. At the same time, Starbucks crossed the ocean to Europe and the Middle East. In 1998, the first UK store opened in London. From there, Starbucks expanded to Spain, Germany, and eventually even Italy, the very country that had inspired Schultz in the first place. Entering Italy was risky. Italians were proud of their espresso culture, and some saw Starbucks as a foreign invader. But Starbucks tried to adapt by offering authentic Italian-style drinks while also introducing its own modern twist. The results were mixed. Some Italians were curious, while others rejected the American brand. One of Starbucks' keys to success was its ability to adapt. Instead of offering the same menu everywhere, Starbucks created drinks that matched local tastes. In Japan, customers could order matcha green tea lattes. In Latin America, Starbucks introduced dulce de leche flavors. In Australia and the UK, the company began selling the flat white, a drink that was already popular there. This strategy helped Starbucks feel less like an outsider and more like a part of local culture. At the same time, the brand kept its core identity. No matter where you went, a Starbucks cafe had the same friendly atmosphere, the same smell of fresh coffee, and the same promise of comfort. It was a balance between the familiar and the local. Not everyone welcomed Starbucks' success. Local cafe owners in France, Italy, and other European countries worried that their traditions were under threat. Critics accused Starbucks of being too commercial, too standardized, and too expensive. Some activists argued that the company was destroying local culture by replacing small cafes with a big American chain. The criticism wasn't only about culture. Environmental groups questioned the waste created by Starbucks paper cups. Others criticized the company for not always paying coffee farmers enough. As Starbucks grew, it had to face the reality that being a global giant also meant being a global target.
Rapid expansion also created problems inside the company. By the mid-2000s, Starbucks was opening several new stores every single day. At first, this seemed like a great success, but soon, Schultz and other leaders noticed something worrying. The company was losing its soul. Baristas were under pressure to serve customers faster, but that sometimes meant less personal service. Stores began to feel more mechanical, less special. Schultz himself admitted that the smell of fresh coffee was disappearing because machines were replacing traditional espresso making. The company that had once been about romance and experience was starting to feel like just another fast food chain. In 2000, Howard Schultz stepped down as CEO, though he remained chairman of the company. For several years, Starbucks continued to grow under new leadership. But by 2007, problems had become clear. The brand was losing its magic. Sales were slowing down, and competitors like Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's were offering cheaper coffee. In 2008, Schultz returned as CEO.
The timing was terrible. The world was facing a financial crisis, and millions of people were cutting back on luxuries. Starbucks, with its premium prices, was in real danger. Schultz immediately took bold action. He closed hundreds of underperforming stores. He stopped expansion and focused on quality instead of quantity. In one famous move, he shut down every Starbucks in the United States for several hours to retrain baristas on how to make the perfect espresso. The message was clear. Starbucks was going back to its roots. Schultz also pushed the company to innovate. Starbucks invested in new technology like free Wi-Fi in stores and a mobile app for ordering ahead. It also began offering more food options, healthier choices, and seasonal favorites like the pumpkin spice latte, which became a cultural phenomenon. Under Schultz's renewed leadership, Starbucks managed not only to survive the crisis, but also to come out stronger. By the early 2010s, it was once again a leader in both business and culture. By the 2020s, Starbucks had over 35,000 stores worldwide. Its logo, once just a small green siren on a storefront in Seattle, had become one of the most recognized symbols on Earth. For many, Starbucks represented comfort, consistency, and community. For others, it symbolized globalization and consumer culture. But whether admired or criticized, Starbucks had undeniably changed the way the world thought about coffee. Starbucks grew from one small store to a global coffee giant. But do you think it changed the world for the better or not? Share your thoughts in the comments below.